Most new illustrators get their start in magazines, but if you have no experience, how the hell are you supposed to know how to price for a half page or a cover illustration? Let's find out. There's lots of different advice out there about how to price your illustrations, and most are valid in their own way. You absolutely should be considering who the client is, whether that's a big name magazine or a smaller indie magazine. You should be considering what the illustration is of, because that will tell you how complicated the work is and how long it might take. You should know how the illustration will be used. Is it only in the print version, or will it be used in different ways? Where is it going to be used? If it's a UK magazine, or if it will be distributed all through Europe as well. And when is it going to be used? Is it just for 1 week in a weekly magazine, or maybe it'll be used for a whole year? There are two whens to consider, because you also need to know when the client needs the work completed. Could be 2 weeks, could be 2 days. You might be advised to work out an hourly rate and calculate a price from there. And that sounds good in theory. If the client is only paying for your time, that would be fine, but you're not factoring in the license. You are licensing this illustration to the client, and part of your payment is the time you've spent working on it, but part of it is the cost for the client to license it from you. You might have a guide that gives prices for a half page or a quarter page, and these can be useful for a general idea, but you'll still be charging too high for some clients, and you could be charging way too low for others. Before you start making any of these calculations, you need to know that every client's budget is different. After you know the who and the what and the where and the when, the first question you should be asking the client is, what is your budget? It isn't rude to ask that. 9 times out of 10, an art director will tell you. They might even put it in their first email to you without you having to ask. There are obviously more polite ways to ask than my blunt approach of just saying, what is your budget? But you could try saying, do you have a budget you can share with me? Or are you able to share your budget? Do you have a budget in mind for this feature? What's your usual budget for a double page spread? The person you're speaking to knows what their budget is for that page or for that feature, and they know what they usually pay for a half-page illustration. They have no real reason not to tell you what it is. It's easier and quicker for them to tell you than it is to exchange 5 or 6 emails dancing around the subject. That isn't to say that you should be blindly accepting whatever they offer, though. If you think it's a fair price, great. You might even be pleasantly surprised. But there's usually some room to negotiate. An art director might share their baseline budget with you willingly, but they probably won't share their maximum budget. If they say £500 and you think it's a little bit low, you might respond with something like this. Could you meet me at £600? I was thinking £600. Any way you could get closer to that? Considering the rush, or how much detail is required, could we say £600? In turn, they might offer to meet you in the middle, and then you've got yourself a 10% raise. Or they might just say yes, and then you've got yourself a 20% raise. It's not always possible to negotiate, but it's worth getting in the habit of trying. It's normal. People do it every day. Certainly nothing to be scared of. The worst they can say is no. If you do feel nervous about it, though, you can start with small numbers. You could ask for £50 extra, and as you get more confident with it, you can be a bit bolder. If you think the illustration is worth £1,000, say so. But it's not going to be easy for an art director to double their baseline budget. If they're willing to negotiate, so should you be. That's a simple example, and you have to factor in the who, the what, the where, and the when, etc., to know if you feel happy with what the client has offered. When they offer you $500, you might immediately feel that it's too low for you to consider, but that's useful information for you. Then you know what your baseline rate is. And if their budget doesn't match your baseline rate, you can say no, politely. You could say, I'm sorry, the budget is a little too low. I'd love to work with you another time if budget allows. I think that sends a clear message. Or if you want to avoid the issue, you can make up some excuse and say, I'm not sure I can fit this in at the moment. Some magazines have very low budgets, but some have surprisingly high budgets. Either way, you'll be glad you asked first before you give a price yourself. Wired magazine loves illustration. I know a lot of illustrators that got their first commissions from Wired. I got my first freelance job from Wired. They use a lot of illustration, which is great, but they don't have big budgets. That means they work with a lot of new artists, and their art directors have to be really good at finding new talent. It's a cool magazine with interesting articles to work on, and they're very supportive of new artists. I don't think you should discount lower paying magazines on price alone. A fun project is a fun project at the end of the day. Recently, I quoted for a magazine in the US that I'd never heard of. I looked it up, seemed kind of small. I think I quoted $1,800 for 4 illustrations of different sizes. The art director very kindly corrected me and said, "We paid $2,250 for this feature last month. Why don't we stick to that?" Art directors are mostly very nice and fair, and they don't want to cheat you out of a fair payment. If I'd followed my own advice and just asked about the budget in this situation, she would have told me. I underquoted by $450 by not asking, and the art director could have saved the magazine $450, but instead she chose to be fair and kind. After a few projects where you ask the client what the budget is, you'll get to know what an acceptable price range is for you. So what about the 1 time out of 10 when the client doesn't want to tell you what the budget is? Well, here are some factors that you can consider. Is the magazine weekly, monthly, or quarterly? Weekly magazines have lower budgets, and in theory, quarterly magazines have higher budgets. They should pay you more because they're using your work for longer. With weekly magazines, it's not only the budget that's lower, but you'll likely have less time to do the job, so it could be less money and harder work. Often new illustrators are incredibly worried about really quick deadlines because they don't necessarily have much experience of working like that from university. But in my experience, it's pretty rare that you don't have at least a week to work on something. 2 or 3 weeks maybe for a monthly magazine. There are exceptions, but it's not something you should worry too much about. If your first commercial job needs to be finished in 2 days and you're really worried about it, you probably shouldn't take it. You can just be honest with the art director and say you're not sure if you can finish in time, and the art director will appreciate that so much more than you delivering something that neither of you are going to be happy with. And once you've got a bit more experience and confidence, you can get back in touch with that art director and just say that you're more prepared for short turnaround times and you'd love to work together. The New Yorker is a dream client for a lot of illustrators. It's a weekly magazine and they love illustration. They have some amazing art directors working there, and your work in the New Yorker can pretty much make you famous. I don't have a lot of experience working with them personally, but from what I know, they move very quickly. I've responded to an inquiry from them within 20 minutes, and the project has already been reassigned to somebody else. If you're sending your work to the New Yorker, you better be very confident you can work quickly, because you don't want to mess up an opportunity like that. What does the contract say? Ask for the contract at the start of the project before you start any creative work. If you don't ask, you might not get it until the end of the project. I have a blog post I'll link to in the description about that subject, but some magazine contracts can have very unfavorable terms in them, and you want to know if that's the case as soon as possible. There are a lot of things to look out for in a contract, and I'm not going to get into it too deep here, but the first thing I'm looking for is the ownership or the rights or the intellectual property section in a contract. You want to make sure that you're not giving away your copyright as soon as you sign the contract. Be on the lookout for phrases like work made for hire or rights will be assigned to client name or company. That means you're selling your work and your copyright. And a magazine doesn't need to own the rights to your work. You should avoid it. A good agreement for a monthly magazine will have something like a 90 days exclusivity term. They'll use it for 1 issue, and you can't then relicense that image to another client until that 90 days is up. And that's fair. It's quite normal for magazines to want the right to use the illustration online forever, because that article will live on their website forever, probably. But if they reused that illustration in another print edition, or they used it with a different article, you should be paid a relicense fee for that. But if you've given away your copyright, you don't get anything. They can do whatever they want with it. If you want to know more about copyright, I'll link to another post in the description. What kind of magazine is it? If it's an indie magazine, they might not pay much, but it might be a super cool publication like Little White Lies, for example. They love illustration and they really support artists. They don't have deep pockets, but it would be pretty great to have your work in there. With big name magazines, it can be really hard to tell what the budgets might be like. Vogue, for example, doesn't pay well. Time does pay well. The prestige and the history of the magazine doesn't necessarily mean that they'll pay more. US finance magazines like Forbes or Barron's pay well, but UK finance magazines like The Economist don't have the same kind of budget at their disposal. Some of the best paying magazines I've come across are American university magazines. They can be very well funded. Airbnb magazine pays well because they really value illustration, and they can, and they want to work with the best illustrators. But the BBC, for example, and all their various magazines, they really value illustration, but they just don't have big budgets. International newspapers and their associated magazines can be pretty good. The Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the New York Times, they have massive readerships all over the world, and they're pretty well funded. The Guardian also has a massive readership all over the world, but doesn't have the same budget. The Guardian are another client that has a really good history of supporting and helping illustrators. As a new artist, you're probably not going to be hired by the top paying magazines straight away. You've got to work your way up the ladder, just like with anything else. And it's clients like Wired and Guardian that give new artists a real helping hand and a boost to their careers. So working with either of those would be a great first step. Where is the magazine? Very generally speaking, and there are always exceptions, but US magazines pay more than UK magazines. UK magazines pay more than French magazines. French magazines pay more than Spanish magazines. This isn't always going to be the case, but the economy of the country is a pretty good guide to what kind of rates you can expect. How many rounds of changes are needed? Standard would be 2 or 3 stages where the client can ask you to make changes, but if it goes much beyond that, you should be asking for an additional fee, depending on how much work it is. If it's one extra change that takes 10 minutes, it doesn't really make sense to waste time negotiating that. But if it's 10 small changes that take 10 minutes each, you really should be charging for that time because it adds up. When you're just starting out, don't get too hung up on price. If you've been paid fairly and you're protecting your rights, just get your work out there to as many magazines as you can, and the bigger budget clients will come later. Any comments or questions? Let me know.